Uh, Good afternoon, and this is continuation of a talk that I did for USF Senior Learning on Science of Sex. I have uploaded two parts on YouTube, and I was surprised with how many people were interested in it. Now, before I start, I should have done this on the earlier talks. This talk is for mature audiences and is not porn. I have tried to cover historic and scientific material as a senior citizen learners with references from popular books and reliable sites. And this is by no means medical advice in any shape. Okay, so after getting that out of the way, let's proceed. The evolution of sex. Okay, the sex is very ancient in evolutionary phases. Starts with the earliest eukaryotes, means the cells with nucleus present. Okay, and so it has a long history. And the question is, obviously, there has to be some benefit. And this thing that you may be aware that you share genes and pass on good genes, but that genetics is and inheritance is quite complicated. Most of the diseases are not inherited in a standard dominant fashion. Even a very well-known trait such as height, which is almost 80% heritable, is not, there are no guarantees that your son will be tall. And because sometimes in statistics, you get regression to the mean, and other factors such as environment have a huge influence. And there is also a science of epigenetics, but I don't want to digress too much. And so this is costly to evolve, but there is always a trade-off. So, and the sexual selection has changed and evolved over time from simple transfer from male gamete to female gamete to elaborate evolutionary constraints and tricks to assure the transmission of propagation of genes. And at the same time, there is a so-called battle of sexes. That's not a modern term by any means, but it goes back to ancient times between males and females through all the animal kingdom. And so this is an interesting subject for those of you who are interested. The respectable and reliable Nature magazine has a popular website called SciTable, which is free. Usually, a lot of the Nature original articles are behind paywall, but this is a very nice discussion from which some of these points were elaborated. Okay. Now, there are some evolution of sex has gone, as I mentioned a little while ago, from eukaryotes to coral, and has evolved for almost 500 million years from the tiniest organisms such as insects to birds to reptiles. And it's so this is convergent evolution that lots of the species experimented with asexual and sexual at the same time. Going back to the earliest multicellular organisms like hydra or coral, which does not move, and once it gets there and grabs the food as it goes by, it primarily just releases sperm out in the water, and same way the female coral just releases things. So there is strength in numbers, there's mass spawning that takes place, and just a random chance of breeding that takes place. Because, and that's it, as you can understand, there's a lot of energy involved in losing this, doing this approach. Okay, now at the same time, then fish have a different strategies, and basically can change sex from a male to female and can be hermaphrodite at times as well. And with grasping develop claspers, which again was the precedent of evolution of penis. Okay, and then again, there was no clear-cut orifice for vagina, and it was just a one orifice for all the bodily excretions, urine, feces, and at the same time for sex as well. So this was the earlier mode for reproduction. Later on, with the rise of amphibians, eggs were released in the water, and finally, with the evolution of reptiles, internal fertilization with amniotic sac evolved. Now, surprisingly, as large as crocodiles can be, and they have a remarkably small penis. Now, when it comes to, obviously, we will have some talk about elephant sex, but when I shudder to think about weight issues for dinosaur sex. The birds, more or less, as they reduced in size and took to air, obviously, it's just like flying in a balloon. You had to reduce weight. So their sex organs actually devolved, so to speak. And they again settle for a simple manner. And the technical term for that is called cloacal kiss. And it's one way. And now we know, so we talked about the various modes that Mother Nature has experimented. We already talked about hermaphroditism in a fish. And with mammals, the size of the animals increased, and more nutrition and longer gestation periods took place. And with internal fertilization, need evolved for providing nutrition for the fetus. And that led to the rise of placenta. And I'll have a lot more to say about how placenta came about with thanks to viruses, but more on that a little later. Okay, let's see, what do we have next? Now, okay, let's get the curiosity stuff out of the way. And we talked about clearing the fallacy about phallus. Okay, and so this was, as I mentioned a little while ago, this was a convergent evolution that took place, over the time. Okay, and we've gone over that, I think, but you can see that snakes and some of the lizards have something called hemipene, means they are gifted or cursed with two penis. And this you can see that how the legs adapted or evolved to a different purpose. Okay, now at the same time, when you get down to turtles and other crocodiles, obviously the numbers were reduced and a more dedicated function evolved. And as I mentioned a little while ago, birds actually lost or reduced size. Okay, and when it comes to mammals, a full-size penis developed with the closure of the urethral tube and separate development of testes. Okay, so, and again, we still, use the same passage for both. The females evolve differently, which we'll talk more about when we discuss basic embryology or in mammals, and primarily focusing on humans. Okay, so much about that, the evolutionary thing. Now, at the same time, there is an interesting talk by a British researcher, and these are some of her slides, that there's an arms race. I'm hoping I can share this with you. She's a very colorful and delightful speaker. And let me see if I can stop this share and find her. Okay. Yeah, if I can find her talk, that would be very nice. You would probably enjoy looking into that. No, I think I'm going to have difficulty finding that at this stage. I think sorry about that, but okay, let's see if I can find it on the. I'm going to still give one more try. Yeah, here it is. Okay, let me see if I can share this. Okay, yeah, here is her talk, The Science of Sex by Dr. Sally LePage.
Neighbour's nest when he wasn't looking. They failed to mention the fact that females will also exchange these rocks for sex. I don't know why that got past the editorial team, and you can insert your own joke about getting your rocks off in there. And bonobos, famous for making love, not war, they make sex with everything. But again, meat is a scarce resource, and it's the males that go and hunt the meat. So if the females want to change from their vegetable diet, then they'll just have sex in exchange for meat. And capuchins, I'm slightly, I don't know, I shouldn't really be including them, but it's a great story. So these researchers trained capuchin monkeys to use money. They decided to, yeah, I know, crazy. But they're like, okay, we'll give them coins and they can exchange them for food. And then the story goes, one researcher saw at the corner of his eye a male and a female. And what looked like the male handed the female a coin, and the female proceeded to have sex with the male. Unfortunately, we don't know the extent to which prostitution forms a valuable part of Capuchin economy, because the researchers then took great pains, it says, to.
Okay, so you can see that she is a very colorful and very knowledgeable speaker at the same time, and this is done at the Royal Institute in UK. So for those of you who are interested, can look it up, The Science of Sex by Dr. Sally LePage. Okay, it's an interesting talk, and this is.
And this forms a strategy called copulatory plugs. The theory being, if I bung her up with my genitals, another male can't get his in either. It happens all over the place. But the scariest one, these are my fruit flies, back to what I was working on. These don't go for scraping out the sperm. These don't go for exploding balls. Their sperm has the power of mind control. Yeah. So the females, when they absorb this protein in the ejaculate called.
Okay, so I think I have some slides for it, but for sake of time, I'm not going to go too much into it. But for those of you who are interested, can look it up. Okay, let me go back to the slide share and slideshow from the current slide. Okay, so this is her slide as we talked about, and so like all sorts of strategies have evolved over time. Okay, and they. And at the same time, some of the other smaller insects have a dramatically interesting cycle as to they go from asexual to sexual. So these are aphids, which you can see there is a tiny little gray bug. So in spring, when they want to produce a large number of eggs, they're a female force feeder and produce females. So there's a large number of females are produced. And then this is kind of self-reduction. And the Greek or technical term that you can use is called parthenogenesis. It may come in handy if you want to impress somebody at a party. Okay, and so this is when during fall, they kind of are perhaps more relaxed, or for whatever reasons, they go to producing sexual forms. And the males, as you can see, they're smaller in size. And so this is, they've used both the strategies to increase their numbers and pass on their genes. Okay, and this is another interesting talk by Dr. Corinne Bonder, and hopefully that won't be, a block. But I think sometimes YouTube does not like sharing this, so I probably won't get into it because sometimes that may create. So this is a relatively older TED talk, only about 10 or 15 minutes, but she's a Canadian biologist and has a very colorful presentation. And the birds and bees are just the beginning. So this was the thrust of the talk, but she talks about the varieties of way the male sex organ has evolved. And she starts out with the earliest primitive ocean organism called paper nautilus, which looks like a coil. I'm sure you've seen nautilus in National Geographic slides, and that has something called hectocotylus, so almost like an arm that is less released and free, okay, and free floating penis, so to speak. So, and this even the great Aristotle talked about it, in ancient classic Greek literature. And moving on to the more evolutionary things that we can identify with, because we don't all live in the ocean, is the South American tapir, which looks like a little like a pig, and that has a prehensile penis, which is large, and I'm sure if you Google it, you can find the pictures, but some of them are behind copyright, so one has to be careful with what you're looking at. And this is directly introduced in the uterus. And similarly, so these are kind of, barnacles outdo all of this. Similarly, so there are varieties of way, a penile or male sex organ has evolved. So it's an interesting book that some of you might like to peruse. Okay. And as Dr. Sally talked about, the mind control in fruit flies. And there's a very reliable source from Science Direct, okay, which is basically the fruit flies, which is the workhorse of genetics studies, as some of you may know from your biology classes. This is a sex peptide, which is, the smaller form of protein, which is released in sperm. And this is way before David Bowie talked about mind control for Major Tom. This sex peptide affects, and as we can focus if, on this diagram that I borrowed from the scientific publication. So you can see how it affects, the food intake, immune response, oviposition, longevity, constipation. And so these are, some of the factors that are influenced, by the chemical, and these are transmitted by neurons. Okay, while the functions that are written in blue on this slide, the sperm binding and stimulation of other hormone synthesis, is transmitted by by a lymph, which is a fluid which is circulating in the body. Okay, so moving on further, and this was absolutely hilarious. Amazon Molly pretends to have sex, basically, so then goes on to reproduce it herself. This is a tiny little fish which is at the bottom of the food chain, but it has sex with the male, but his sperm is not utilized. It's expired eventually, and just reproduces itself by parthenogenesis or self-reproduction. So, okay. And now this is another very scholarly talk on evolution of males and female by an American biologist. This is again borrowed from the Royal Institution. And I think just with the difficulty I have with going back and forth between a browser to the slides, I'm not going to bother with it. But I think you can see the title, and it's a nice 1 hour talk. The most interesting or bizarre thing would be a big fish in South America called anglerfish, which is originally like a bottom dweller. And now you may wonder what this little appendage is. No, that is not the fish's antenna, but that is the male of the species. Okay, the male literally burrows in the flesh of the female, and the only thing that is left are the reproductive organs, basically. So that's a dramatic way of going to extreme length to reproduce. Okay, so nature has all sorts of bizarre things that has taken place, and you can see the size different. The fish herself has ferocious teeth, and it's a formidable predator. Okay, now I think this one will not induce, and this is about the frog and the organ that is called a clasping organ called implex. Okay, which is basically implexus, sorry, and that is a Latin origin word, which is primarily refers to as embrace. Okay, let's see. Hopefully, I can show some of it. Okay, I think I'm going to cut down the silly music. Okay, so you get the idea as to how, and the females actually is at risk. She may suffocate or drown. So this is sex going to, and sometimes the females have a defensive strategy that they can vibrate if they are not in a receptive cycle. Okay, and this has got to be the take cake of all the duck eversion, which some of you may have heard about it, and this is like going to all extreme to make sure to extreme to make sure that it is yours, the genes that are transmitted and not other ones. And this is the duck penis. Which is literally like a corkscrew. Okay. And so that's, going to extremes to make sure that paternity is assured. So, okay. Now, this is an interesting, BBC, as usual, they do a very nice series that was called Animals. And this is, again, somewhat older clip, but it's interesting. And due to copyright, I won't be able to share it. But the examples that, that the clip shows is one that is well known is it starts with the praying mantis. That's a tiny little insect that while they're copulating, the female will actually eat the male alive, okay, starting from head onwards. And this is obviously even this tiny little insect does have some neurons or at least a rudimentary thing that we could call brain. And when that part is lost, the male of this species loses all inhibition, and the neurons for the lower part of the anatomy goes into what is known as hyperpolarization, and it loses all inhibition in turn leading to what can, in crude terms, be best described as wild sex. Okay. Now, another example from the same clip is a tiny Australian mouse, okay, which during estrus or when they're mating, that's literally during the season will have a non-stop sex without eating or without doing anything else. Okay, and it's so much so that it will, with the lack of nutrition, the male mouse's immune status will get compromised. He will catch infections and will be dead before before 1 year. So that's almost an ultimate sacrifice to. So it probably reinforces what Richard Dawkins used to say about selfish gene. The gene does not care. Genes do not care what happens to the body in this case, and as long as they are propagated. Now, it's obviously there are a lot more nuances to than that. Now, getting to the bigger animals, we did not dwell because we don't have much data on dinosaurs as to how they reproduced. Obviously they laid eggs, but and so that was a different mode of reproduction. But we know the elephants do not lay eggs, and they actually have sex. And when the male elephant goes into heat, that produces smell called musk. And at the same time, and at that time he can take on other males which are competing, and produces huge amount of testosterone, and at the same time secretes chemical called pheromones, which obviously the search for pheromones in humans have gone, but have not been productive. But elephants in their urine, which they produce several hundred liters of urine, and their penis enlarges to almost like a 5 meter. So you can imagine the size. That's for the American audience. That's like 15, more than 15 to 20, almost 15 to 20 feet. Okay, and then the prehensile penis has a mind of its own. It curves and grabs the female, and is able to have sex, which lasts for a royal time of 45 seconds. Okay, so it's an altogether, it's almost functions like an elephant trunk. So one could say that the elephant grows an extra trunk. Bonobos, which are the apes and closely related to chimpanzees. Now, unlike chimpanzees, which live in a society, bonobos are the hippies of the ape world, and their life and society revolves around sex. Instead of fighting and killing each other in troops, they settle arguments and favors by sex. And almost just like the early hippie days, anything goes, a male to male sex, a male to female sex. And so, and this is, goes around. So that's a different society that has evolved. Okay. And again, we talked about this earlier, that certain fish can change. So that is the hermaphroditism. Clownfish start out as males, but the females die. The largest male becomes a female. Largest female produces more eggs. And so this is, again, on the other side, small gobies starts out as female. So then they change into sex. So you can just see that sex and gender are a fluid concept, and that has a lot to do with the current thinking that goes on, especially in the United States. And some fish, such as groupers, a blue-headed wrasse, and they are transsexual, and so this is, and sometimes, and this, some of the gobies can be, males can pretend to be females and sneak in and have sex. Okay, or, so it goes, all sorts of permutation combinations are in force in the animal kingdom. Okay. Okay, and I think this one will not create a copyright strike, so hopefully I can show this one.
Kate from Minute Earth. And before we start, I want to let you know that this video covers the ins and outs of hyena genitalia. So if that's not something you're keen to learn about, you can check out some of our other videos. But from the comments on our recent hyena video, we learned that a lot of people are really curious about what exactly is going on with hyena genitalia. And they're not alone. Everyone from Aristotle to Hemingway to a host.
Okay, so again, for sake of time, I think I'm just going to skip through this thing. The spotted hyena has a pseudopenis.
That females have to mate and give birth through what's essentially a penis. Mating via pseudopenis is about as awkward as you might imagine. In order to to make sex possible, the female actually has to retract her pseudopenis. So male hyenas can't force females to have sex. And speaking of which, we got a lot of comments about a mom's pseudopenis actually has to rip for her to give birth successfully, which leaves behind a stretchy patch that does make birth easier the next time. In our earlier video, we talked about why it sucks to be a male hyena, but there's also a lot that sucks about being a female hyena. So why do they have such incredibly unwieldy genitalia? Is fending off male suitors so critical that pseudopenises evolved as protection? Doubtful. Females are dominant enough to keep suitors in check without any help. Are female hyenas trying to confuse others into thinking they're males? Probably not. Even experienced humans can tell what's pseudo and what's not. And hyenas have lots of other ways of distinguishing females from males. So far, we just don't have a convincing.
Okay, so you get the idea. So that is about as bizarre as one can get. And then again, sex has lots of benefits, as we talked about, with the gene transfer and producing as many copies of your genes as possible. And so, and there, usually, while in humans, we talk about female attractiveness and male as a provider, but throughout the animal world, that is not the case. It's the male who is much more attractive and goes to all sorts of extent to impress the female, who can be very choosy or as it's known. And the classic example is the female hen and the male peacock. And you can see that the plumage, this has got to cost a lot in terms of energy to grow and maintain this sort of plumage. And that, the great Charles Darwin talked about it in Descent of Man, his second book, less well read. And I referred to it earlier by Desmond Morris. He talks about it as well. Okay. And so this is not all changes can be explained by sexual attraction, has a lot to do with it. And most recently, again, how attractive people get more salary, and so beauty does have advantages both in not just in animal kingdom but in humans. And this is and that again, obviously, the people who go on the dating sites on their phones, so the swipe right has a lot to do with the first impression of attractiveness, and again, we go back to our evolutionary things that sometimes people who are quote unquote baby faced are much more attractive. Okay. And there's a selective pressure that leads to gene pools. And again, that can be, it's like winning a genetic lottery, and again, that's it's a well-known fact, and I will not elaborate too much on it. Okay. And again, like Dr. Sally talked about, the prostitution is rampant, as you can see, from the penguins to the apes and monkeys, and the stones for exchange. That was almost shocking to me to hear about. And sometimes, in other animals like rams, they actually prefer gay sex. And sometimes, this is, and that for a while, there was a big uproar, I think probably in the late 80s, about the so-called gay gene. Okay. And there were arguments on both sides that took place, that the gay community was very delighted with that. At the same time, it was considered hardwire, and it created a lot of controversy. Okay. And then the scientist who did the work on it, named Dick Schwab, was able to locate some areas in a bed nucleus of Stria terminalis, and since his research still was very scientifically. Okay, I think I'm going to pause recording for a second. Okay, now we'll get down into the real science, basically after the unusual journey through the animal kingdom, anatomy and physiology. Okay, now there is, as it's not just in the animal kingdom, but even in human beings, the people have had urge to reproduce, and obviously the women's were treated as property, and that led to a lot of powerful males, usually soldiers, and even even some of the other people with who had resources. An example of comes with a Russian man named Fyodor Vasilyev. He was born in 1707, lived to almost a ripe old age, and almost 70, 75 plus, and he has a record for fathering 69 children and 18 with his second wife. So one has to feel sorry for the poor woman. At the same time, he was outdone by a sultan of Morocco, okay, who is said to have fathered about 800 children, okay. And last but not the least, the great Mongol warrior Genghis Khan, who lived in the 17th century, and his Y chromosome can be found, and traces of Y chromosome, not there, can be found in hundreds of thousands of people all across the Central Asia. So he was again very randy or fertile as so, and there's this every talk about the science of sex has to come out with the so-called overtold jokes about sex and Martians, as to Martians came to the world and they find out all about the human society and ready to go back to Mars, but were curious about how reproduction took place. So finally, reluctantly, a couple is shown having intercourse, and the Martian's question was, "Where's the baby after they finished?" Okay, it takes 9 months. Okay, and the question was, why all the rush at the end? Okay, so that was a joke that I had heard a long time ago. So, but the science is quite complicated. It involves neurobiology, anatomy, physiology, environment, endocrinology, okay, cultural, and more recently, genetics. And so the sex is there because of its pleasurable. You get this dopamine surge, oxytocin release, okay, stress reliever. So not just so there's a instantaneous gratification that is advantage. At the same time, it is there for the good of the species, leaving copies of your gene. Okay, so all your reward circuits, and we talked about that little mouse who almost is ready to die. Okay, and the general mechanism has been, or the actual anatomy physiology has remained same what it was evolved, because nature, if you know some biology, is very conservative in one sense, that what has worked, it just keeps that. That is one of the reasons why we share genes with the tiny fruit fly. Okay, and so what has worked, and it just improves upon it or modifies it, as the case may be. But most of the time, the concept is, preserved and carried on for in future evolutionary. Okay, and these are some of the very educational videos. Okay, human fertilization, and obviously this is a controversy right now with the onset of life in United States. Okay, but I think this may clarify as to one can classify the fertilization at various stages, called blastomere to gastroloid, and we'll talk about it as we go along in this talk. Okay, so this is, the classical genetics that you would have studied about. The spermatozoa enters, okay, the cell, and then once one sperm penetrates, then, the layers become resistant to other insertions. Okay, so you don't get multiple enters, and then the polar bodies develop, and the nuclei fuse. And after a certain time, the cell division takes place. This the mitosis process, and then the cells would multiply. Obviously earlier there was a meiosis, which is the reduction division, and then it becomes a blastomere. So this is how we all got started. That reminds me of the joke in the movie Graduate as to how Elaine got started. So that's for those of you who have a long memories or have seen the classic movie, may recall this. Okay, so this is a history of this. This is University of New South Wales in Australia has an excellent course on embryology. So a lot of this material has been borrowed from their talks. Historically, in 1827, Carl Ernest von Baer was the first to visualize a female egg in a dog inside the follicle, and still, it was there was still the traditional teaching had a hard time to accept this idea that a lot of the biologists or his contemporaries continued to emphasize the role of the sperm. Okay, we already talked about parthenogenesis. Okay, and then again, it's the males invest less, so females do the choosing. So and now Darwin obviously did not have the benefit of genetics, so he was puzzled with the need for males because the females could selfly reproduce and can jolly on carry on the species. So, but obviously there's a big trade-off that takes place. Now, it is this, most of you may be aware that women are born with all the eggs that they will ever have, and they're not replenished, okay, unlike in other animals, okay. So they're, each month a group of follicles gets activated and starts developing. Only one healthy follicle will continue and will release at the time of ovulation, okay. And while the less vigorous ones will regress and eventually die, through which only the best quality of egg is available for forming an embryo. And so that is the regular menstrual cycle that you may remember from basic physiology. Okay, and it occurs free floating during 1 week for fertilization, the last menstrual period, and the mitosis forms a solid ball of cell, which is called morula, and then a hollow ball is formed, which is called blastocyst. Okay, so this is, you can just see how day one, and then it takes, the process takes several days for it to be, to form in the blastocyst, which is the hollow ball, because that's where the cavities have to form, because all of us have, cavities from our mouth to the anus or our bottom. Okay, so this is, how the egg formation takes place. It takes several days for the process to get started. Okay, now I said earlier that we'll talk a bit about placenta. Placenta evolved about a couple of 200 million years ago, and there was a happy accident, type of thing that they, the cells celled some retroviruses, and that had a lot to do with formation of placenta. So the genetics of placenta owes a lot to retrovirus incorporation that has taken place. Okay, so the word of placenta is origin, a Latin origin. It's a type of a cake, and that is, with the internal fertilization and carrying pregnancy, hidden. Okay, it provides a lot of nutrition, oxygen, and literally fetus acts as a parasite and invades the mom, okay, starting from week 1 onwards. And then again, later on, a further invagination takes place at week 15. And there is a genetic warfare sort of goes on, because obviously it's a foreign tissue with the male gene. And so there has to be an immunological compromise takes place. So to protect the fetus from mom's immune cells, there are varieties of genes that are involved in this process. There are called synectic genes, and some of the genes are silenced, some are activated, and this is another gene that helps growth of the fetus. Not infant. Okay, and that is the insulin gene, that same like the insulin growth factor, so that helps the fetus grow. Okay, so and this is the insulin-derived growth factor. Okay, so I can just see, hopefully let's elaborate a little bit on it. Potential imprinted gene action is a IGFR, so that comes from the male maternal placenta components. Okay, and we can see there are varieties of spinal arteries that actually burrow into the maternal uterus. So the blood is surrounding it, and so there are varieties of cells that are, exchanging, and there are other genes that are involved as well. There are some of the genes that have to do with thyroid, some of the hormonal genes are involved, genes for brain growth. So it's a complicated dance that takes place between the fetus, which is partly unfamiliar genes, and mother's genes. So it's a very complicated or exquisitely evolved molecular biology. Okay, and this is, like placenta previa. So placenta can be abnormal in varieties of ways. It can cause serious problems with labor and delivery. This is the normal placenta is at the top, nicely layered, and the child is connected with umbilical cord. Now, if the placenta is in the wrong position, one can easily imagine it doesn't take a PhD to figure out that with the birth, with the onset of labor and delivery, this can tear, because it's an extremely vascular tissue and can cause hemorrhage and death. So this is basically, and this was, I was kind of chuckling as to when Toyota back in the 80s named their van Previa. Okay. And so this was, and so this is one of the common abnormalities that can occur and can cause both maternal and fetal death. And so this is, and a mother and fetus, because sugar is essential nutrient. So there is a sort of a fight that goes over sugar, and that it may explain as to why the increase, 14% of mothers develop diabetes, gestational diabetes mellitus. Okay, because the insulin growth factor creates large babies, and provides extra blood, and it also causes rise of maternal blood pressure, can lead to an illness called eclampsia. Okay, and only 3 species have the placenta formation. Okay, even amongst mammal, one type of lowland gorillas, other types of monkeys, Patagonian monkeys, and humans. Okay, so they have the placenta. Otherwise, placenta is very rare because you can just see it. Now, this is the journey that goes through the week 2nd right after fertilization that has taken place in the uterus, that the fertilized egg, it's transmitted. First it occurs, after ovulation, is first cleavage, 4-cell cleavage, day of 4, and the egg makes a slow and steady journey by the time it's, day 6 or 7 to the uterus, and basically it gets implanted, and that's the onset of pregnancy. Okay, And this again secreted with certain hormones that take place in the human body, and the hormones were secreted in the urine. And the old pregnancy test was done with the rabbits and later on with mice. Okay, so it took a while for the science to evolve to accurate diagnosis of pregnancy. Okay, and so okay, now this is the slide for the internal and external development takes place from conception to week 6. Embryo is sexually indifferent earlier and can go either ways, male or female. Okay, and then external genitalia, in the earlier stage look identical. Okay, and they're sort of undifferentiated. You can just see there is a cloaca that reminds you of the earlier thing, because we talked about in the birds, and there are glands, ducts that are called the paramesonephric ducts, and the early onset of gonads that takes place. Then gradually, with the folding of the tube, the genital tubercle develops and anal ped develops, and that goes on to evolve into sex differentiation as time goes by. So it's a time-consuming process. Okay, and that by 7 weeks, the differentiation, male embryo has Y chromosome that has a region called SRY segment. Okay, and that has a lot to do with silencing of because that way you don't get duplication of the chromosomes. Okay, and again, this is, you saw this slide earlier, and at the 7-week male embryo. Okay, 7-week female embryo has no Y chromosome and no SRY as a component. Okay, so external genitalia, week 7. Okay, so these are some of the basic embryology that maybe more than you wanted to know, perhaps. And by 12 weeks, finally, the transformation actually takes place, that the testes develop. Okay, and then gradually the first external genitalia. So it takes almost 3 months for the development of the sex differentiation takes place. Okay, and on this other hand, similarly in female genitalia develop by week 12. So the sex is finally formed. Okay, now some of the facts about female reproduction. Okay, this women, we already talked about that women are born with all the eggs that they will need. Okay, and we talked about, and sometimes women may not be able to, they may feel some slight pain at the time of ovulation, but most of the time, some people, so this pain during the mid-cycle is a German word for it. It's called Mittelschmerz. Some even can tell that they are mid-cycle pain, that the egg has been released. Okay, the follicle, which turns yellow after ovulation, and after ovulation, okay, the cells around the outside of the follicle change and start producing hormone called progesterone, which is important in preparing the lining of the uterus for embedding. The cells have turned yellow, and that is one of the reasons why this structure is called corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow body, and start to degrade and stop producing progesterone after 14 days, unless fertilization has occurred. Okay, and the part of the uterus that is most connective tissue is the lower part called cervix. Now, cervix, I think for those of you who have medical background and have done pelvic examination would realize that the cervix is kind of a tough and hardened tissue, okay, which joins parts of the bodies to each other. And its cervical connective tissue is made of proteins such as elastin and collagen. So that's an elastic tissue, so that can stretch a little bit. Collagen is not that, but it's a strong protein, basically. And as we talked about earlier, placenta grows inside the uterine wall. If fertilization occurs, then the embryo is attached to the wall of the uterus and begins an implant. 10 days after fertilization, the embryo is completely embedded. So it's part of the mom's body. The endometrium grows over the implanted site, and they continue to grow within this small space. Okay, and this is so the number of eggs that women are limited has a lot to do now, comes into how people with infertility as it goes along, as with pushing the reproductive age later and later. And that is, at least in the United States, some of the major tech companies are giving funds or covering that with insurance to freeze the eggs and giving rise to the saving them later for in vitro fertilization and a whole new industry that we'll talk about towards the end of the series of talks has developed into not just in vitro fertilization but surrogate motherhood, where women would rent out their uterus to carrying child for infertile couple, or even for two males who are married in a gay, or are in a gay relationship. And this was an article from Aeon magazine, which why pregnancy is a biological warfare between mother and so it's an online, generally, a free magazine. And this is an interesting read for those who are interested, can find it themselves. Okay, I have the link, and hopefully they'll show up in the, in the talk. Okay. So this is, and the weird practice that has evolved in some of the cities, at least in the Western world, about eating placenta. Okay, I think so. That again, what to make out of it, that I'm not going to get into it at this stage. Okay, and there's something called the Uterine Fetal-Embryonic Defense System. Okay, and that is basic premises that both soluble and cell surface is associated with what is known as a glycoprotein, which is a combination of sugar molecule and protein that is present in the reproductive system and is expressed on the sex cells, male and female, that suppresses the immune response from the mother and prevents the rejection of the fetus as it takes place. So this is varieties of study that there are mobile genetic elements that have sequences of gene sequences which placental mammals evolved. Okay, and that had a benefit on the regulatory T cells, which are the immune cells, and a lot of the antigens can trigger and cause suppression of the T cells and avoid the so-called maternal-fetal conflict that is induced by the maternal immune system. So when this particular T regulatory cells are absent, they respond to the paternal antigens, infiltrate the placenta, and cause inflammatory changes. Okay, so this is, and sometimes so that can, if this war is not won, okay, then that can lead to abortion or miscarriage, as the case may be. And a lot of the immune response was proposed in the classical sense by the two British immunologists, Dr. Barnett and Peter Medaver. Okay, now, this is just a general quiz type thing as to testes. Test your knowledge about testes. Okay, as to which testis is lower. Okay, the answer would be in most men, the left testicle hangs lower than the right. The right is usually larger. Being asymmetrical means that the testes stay cool and take up less space in the scrotum. Okay, right. Now, why are testes outside the body when they're so prone to injury? They're located outside the body to cater for their sensitivity towards temperature. sperm production and survival is best if the temperature is lower, a few degrees lower than this thing. So do they disappear? It is normal for testes to move up and down within the scrotum. The testes is surrounded by cremaster muscle that can contract and lift them upwards towards the pelvis. Okay, if the contraction occurs after, say, we are exposed to cold air or when the male is sexually aroused. Okay, and are larger better. It is impossible for testes to completely retract and disappear in the abdomen. Okay, so that's an irrational fear that is referred to as Coro syndrome. Is more common in some Asian cultures. Okay. Now, obviously, an injury to the testicle is awfully painful and hurts. Okay, because they're not protected by bone, fat, or large muscles, so they're going to absorb the whole force of the strike, and so that's one of the reasons. Okay, and now again that I must have a weird sense of humor sometimes, and pardon me. Okay, that in baseball the testicular protection it came into use much more earlier than head helmets. So go figure out what was important to men. Okay, I mean that's some wise guy had a tongue in cheek. Now, if I'm more prone to looking at some of the British websites, and there is a college that has been in existence since 1500 called Gresham College, and one of the professors there, okay, Dr. Joanna Bork, did a classic. She's a professor of rhetoric. Okay, whatever rhetoric is, that's a classical, the 5 disciplines that Oxford and Cambridge used to teach. Okay, before Enlightenment, so there was so she's a professor of rhetoric, and this is a talk on her on testes and clitoris. Okay, so this is a link for those who are interested, and she's again a very colorful and very knowledgeable speaker that some of you might enjoy if you want to know more about it. Okay, now this is some of the interesting things about semen. Normal amount can vary from a small 1.5 to 6 cc, and the amount concentration is the one that matter. Okay, and it's smelly. The color can vary. Okay, and I think okay, so that was very. Okay, so the seminal fluid, which is a lot of it comes from prostate. There are some other glands called bulbourethral glands. Okay, and the amount of sperm that is released in a normal ejectorate, it's huge. It can vary anywhere from 15 to 200 million. Okay, so this is why it's such an overkill that is, I think, not well understood. Okay, now sometimes the vaginal fluid can be acidic and can cause damage, and some of the sperms, again, they do not have a directional compass, so some of them can go in the wrong way. Okay, and again, there can be varieties of variation that can take place, as to some have very small heads, some have large heads, so there can be various deformities that can take place. So, and some of the seminal fluid has what is known as signaling molecules that communicate with the immune response. Okay, and the females the system is kind of choosy and selects out the best quality sperm. So it's just like going shopping and picking out the ripest tomato. Okay, so this was this has a historical bearing that obviously the science was not, advanced enough in the Aristotelian days. Okay, and this were the spermatozoa were first seen by the father of microscopy, a guy named Leeuwenhoek, who was a Dutch lens grinder of par excellence. And with due credit to the Royal Society, his findings were accepted, even though he was not, quote unquote, a gentleman. And that was the start of microscopy as we came to know it. And so that's an interesting story about Leeuwenhoek and the Royal Society interactions. That was a time when, so the name sperm comes from a meaning Greek origin. It comes from meaning seed. Okay, and so this is and then again the ideas as to what it contained was a mystery. Just like some of the early astronomers looked at the moon with less than ideal magnification and imagine canals on moons for about 100 years. A lot of the microscopists earlier imagined there was a tiny little fully formed human that resided in the head of the spermatozoa, and that was the origin of the word called homunculus. Now, obviously, that did not turn out to be the case, and at the contemporary of Darwin, a guy named Gregory Mendel was working in what is in Eastern Europe, and proposed the finding of genes, the concept. But again, at that time, the communication wasn't as wide as it is now. Okay, so I already showed you this slide, and I think hopefully this will show.
Normal. A typical human sperm looks like this, or does it? Look at semen under a microscope and you'll see that not all sperm cells look typical or normal. Some sperm have small heads, some large heads, and a few sperm have 2 heads. Similarly, some sperm have 2 tails, others have strangely shaped tails, and a few sperm have no tails. The World Health Organization says that a human semen sample is normal if only 4% of sperm have a normal appearance, which means that up to 96% of sperm can look abnormal, but that's okay. It is, however, worth pointing out that only normal-looking sperm reach and fertilise an egg. Okay, that's 4 fun facts about semen. If you're keen for more, read on. I've listed some more facts after this video. Normal. A typical...
Okay, so the sperm under the microscope, when in a fallopian tube that undergoes preparation, sort of to complete the process of fertilization, can be called as a sperm activation. It probably, this may sound bizarre, it kind of goes soft in their head, which helps them release a certain chemical or enzymes, and the tails become more mobile. So it's like preparing a final attack, so to speak. It's penetrating to reaches the layer of the follicle called zona pellucida. It binds to things with variety of receptors, and reactions takes place. There are holes that are poked inside the membrane, and finally penetration occurs, and which reaches the oocyte.
Normal.
Okay, and I'm sorry that I've repeated already side. Now, but the other facts that are interesting that I will share with you, because we already answered this question, but I had some more facts. So instead of putting them on slide, I'll just discuss it. Adult testes can make over 200 million sperms per day, but it takes 74 days to make a sperm. Now, quote unquote, blue balls are a real thing, even though they don't actually turn blue, because this is this term that describes testicular pain that can occur after prolonged sexual stimulation without ejaculation. In Latin, the word testes means witness and testicle. That is because in Roman times, a male witness would have to place his hands on genitals while swearing an oath rather than on his heart. That is before Christianity. Okay. And interestingly, on coming to this side of the Atlantic, the word avocado is Aztec word for testicle. So go figure that next time when you have your avocado salad. The testes produce more than 90% of testosterone in men. The rest is made by adrenal gland. And there are varieties of illnesses that can take place over testes, called torsion of the testes, cyst formation, epididymis, cancer, and last but not the least, an illness that is not seen here, but was common in mosquitoes called elephantiasis. Okay, so this can be a serious, where the testicles do enlarge. Okay, and that is one of the reasons why the self-examination should be encouraged for male, not just breast examination for women, but males should be encouraged to do self-examination. Okay, and I'll just go through a couple of more slides and then we'll stop for today. And this is just the basic anatomy of male and female urethra. And you can see this is the prostate gland, and there's the called membranous portion and the penile portion. And these are the varieties of areas that surround the penis. They're called corpora. And similarly, the external female anatomy, clitoris, the urethral orifice, the labia, and the Bartholin glands, which secrete this thing. So, okay, and then some researchers have done research on the so-called periurethral tissues, and traction has a role, in fulfilling orgasm. They're pulled aside. Now, sometimes, the penis, at least in the American society, is still measured in inches, type thing. So sometimes, not visible shaft in many when it's not fully erect. And the size really does not make a dramatic difference. It is, like, okay, ideal penis has long prepuce or foreskin. And we already talked about the role of circumcision, which has become norm in varieties of monotheistic cultures. Okay, and then again, back in the between 1860s and 1930s, it was a popular measure that was encouraged to prevent touching and masturbation. Okay, and then the area obviously becomes less sensitive, but the fringe benefit is it is easier to keep it clean and reduces the risk of venereal diseases. Okay, now this may come as a surprise or shock to you. Humans have the largest penis amongst all the primates. Okay, and perhaps we don't understand why. It was over-engineering by nature. Okay, and this is again, the vaginal depth is about 2.5 inches, while the penis size about 5. So why that is, that is again, it's and again, so may have a lot to do with some hormonal connection. So there are various theories on it, but no real answer. Okay, now this again, and they give it to the Brits that they have something called the Vagina Museum that opened in 2017. So there was, and now on the other hand, if you go further north, there's a penis museum in Iceland. Okay, so, and again, the British humor can be a little bit upsetting to the American audience. They were pretty miffed or muffed when we learned. So that was one. So it was founded, I think, and it discusses anatomy and health. So for those of you who get easily offended, I think they can probably close their eyes. This talks about the anatomy, health, and the vulvar diversity and role. So this is from their website, and I'm sure it's not copyrighted. This is part of their permanent exhibit. Okay. Again, we can just to refresh your memory. This is the male reproductive system. Okay, on a side view, starting from outside inwards, the foreskin of the penis, penile glans area, and urethral opening, the vas deferens, for getting the spermatic fluid, testicles, and they take a long, laborious way around and through the abdominal muscle going over the bladders, and the prostate gland is in the middle, and these are the various spongiform tissue which gets engorged with venous blood. Okay, and at the time of erection. Okay, and again the spinal cord, and we talked about the varieties of glands which play upon the sperm generally starts forming at puberty, and the testes have varieties of tubules, and this can be, there's a convoluted thing that can be as long as almost 1,000 feet if it laid out. Okay, and it contains the spermatogonial stem cells, and there are other cells that produce testosterone, and the size difference between egg and a sperm is vast, about 100 times bigger. Okay, and last but not the least, there are various pet names, that are for genitals, that a lot of time the word penis and vulva and vagina were considered taboo in the regular language. Okay, and then okay, and okay, and this is a website that which has from Gresham College, which has all the varieties of pet names. So I don't think I'm going to recite all the names, type of thing. But I'm sure a lot of you, if you have children, they probably may have learned about it on their bathroom walls. And okay, so different ways to identify the male and female anatomy that has become part of the zeitgeist. Okay, and I think we've gone over 1 hour, so I will stop the share and I will end this talk, and we'll continue next time. Hopefully this will be of interest. Okay, I will stop the recording and end the discussion.